Hi, I'm Professor Bendersky. Now we're going to talk about a strategic model for change. I'm going to introduce you to Kotter's 8 steps to leading corporate transformation. And throughout all of this, I'm going to tell you an example so that it kind of makes a little bit more sense. And the example I'm going to talk to you about is universities adopting the technology that you're using right now, which is online course content delivery. And this was an idea that only came up maybe about 10 years ago, and there was a lot of debate amongst universities about the pluses and minuses of online course delivery. And many people felt that it just wasn't as high, wasn't as the same quality, and wasn't a good idea. But over time, especially when the costs of face-to-face education, traditional education, rose more and more and more, and when the financial crisis hit in 2008, college graduates and graduate students had a really hard time getting jobs that paid enough to justify or pay back their investment in their education. And universities started really feeling a push on their market and on their revenues. And with that sense of a potential crisis looming, more universities started taking the idea of moving to these online course delivery models a lot more seriously. And so with that background, I'm going to tell you how this movement towards online content delivery took place as using these 8 steps to corporate transformation. So the first one is establishing a sense of urgency. So universities that were able to communicate to their constituents the sense of urgency that I just told you in that story about, if we don't adopt this technology, we're going to not have enough students of the caliber that we need to enroll in our schools in order to cover our costs. We're just going to lose revenue, and we may actually be unable to sustain the quality of an institution that we have with the current model if we don't adopt this new technology. Now, let me say up front here that if you don't do the first step, there's no point moving to the second step. You kind of have to have that sense of urgency before you're going to be able to move forward. Having established that, the second step is to form a powerful guiding coalition. And what you want here is the people who are going to be influencers with the key stakeholders who are needed to adopt the change. And in particular, you probably want to have some of your prime skeptics on this guiding coalition, because if you can get your chief skeptic to buy into the need for change and the vision for change, that individual is going to end up being a very, very strong champion. In this university example that I've been talking about, universities that moved towards this in this direction put together coalitions that included students and faculty and administrators, maybe executive education, like we did at Anderson, and really figured out together who was going to be representing each of the key stakeholder groups and who would be a liaison back to those groups to help communicate the need for those groups to adopt this change. With that guiding coalition formed, then they need to create a vision. Now you may ask, this seems out of order. How can you have a coalition come together around change without a vision? This goes back to something we talked about earlier, which is if you don't have participation in creating the change vision, you're not going to get the kind of buy-in you need to implement that change. And so in Kotter's model, first you pull together your influencers and use them together to participate in crafting a vision for the change. It's different from the sense of urgency. That's why we need to change. The vision is what the new state is going to be like. This is what we're moving towards. In the university example, effective visions were very concrete and actionable and really ambitious. So for instance, the university may have said, we are going to move 20% of our classes into an online delivery system within the next 3 years. With that vision, which is clear, actionable, and motivating, it's ambitious, then all of the members of that guiding coalition need to communicate the vision over and over and over. It's impossible to over-communicate the vision. That tagline, we're going to move 20% of our courses into an online delivery model in the next 3 years, needs to pervade all of the communications from members of the guiding coalition to all of their constituents in every conversation they have. This is necessary to overcome some of the sources of resistance that we talked about earlier in terms of believing that this is a real change, a long-term change, and not just the flavor of the month. The next step is empowering others by removing obstacles. And by this, I mean both real and perceived obstacles. Again, remember, some of the individual sources of resistance to change is fear of change and fear that the competencies and expertise that I have today are not going to be relevant or as necessary, or I'm not going to be as accomplished going forward because I won't have the abilities to do what I need to do. For faculty, for instance, shifting from the traditional face-to-face classroom-based delivery to an online delivery for many people was a huge obstacle. If you are used to teaching in a discussion-based format with an audience that's interacting with you, trying to figure out how to take that material and present it in a recorded format without that give and take can be really difficult. Successful universities overcame those perceived obstacles by providing training, by providing assistance with transforming the materials that faculty had developed for face-to-face classrooms so that it could be delivered more effectively in an online format. Maybe some training about the technology and other things to really ease that transition and help those faculty see how their course material would work in this different technological environment. Next, it's really important to create some short-term wins. A vision or change goal of the scope that I described here, moving 20% of our 20% of our courses to an online format. That's big, and in this vision, they're optimistically saying over a 3-year period. That's long-term. In order to achieve movement towards that ultimate vision, it helps immensely to break that change vision into smaller chunks and to enable some short-term wins so people can see how incrementally moving down that path is going to be beneficial. So in this university example, perhaps the first courses that are identified for transition to an online format are those that are most easily transferable, maybe the ones that have a more of traditional lecture format that doesn't involve a lot of face-to-face interactions, so it's relatively easy to record them and deliver them electronically. Having those positive experiences out there then communicates to other people for whom the transition may be more difficult that it's attainable, success is attainable, and that the adopting the change is quite effective. With extensive long-term change endeavors like this one, you need to then invest in really maintaining momentum. We all have many demands for our time and our attention and our resources, and there will be other things that come up that may distract us from the focus on implementing this change. So in order to maintain momentum, you need to continue communicating, you need to continue empowering, you need to keep incrementally building on those short-term wins, and don't fail to lose sight of the objective of implementing the change by becoming complacent. You just can't make the mistake of believing that because you've had some short-term wins, the momentum is there automatically and things will just snowball on their own. You have to proactively, and your guiding coalition has to proactively continue to reinforce the change message and continue to push things forward. And finally, you need to make the changes stick by nurturing a culture that embraces the change. Now, this could involve personnel changes, maybe some older people who are stuck in traditional ways and less inclined to adopt the changes leave, and they're replaced by younger, new employees who embrace the changes. Maybe they grew up with the changes; they're more familiar. In the university model, that's as older faculty retire and younger faculty are hired. Many of those young faculty themselves, as graduate students, have been exposed to online course delivery already. So for them, it's much more automatic. Doing other things like investing in socialization, the reward structure that really supports and reinforces people who have adopted and embraced the change and made the efforts to transition, all are ways to convey that this new model is part of our organizational cultural value, and is something that we're going to really embrace going forward. So in Kotter's model, you want to go through each one of these steps in turn, Don't try to jump them. Don't try to form a coalition until you've established a sense of urgency. Don't create a vision without participation from your guiding coalition. And as you go through each one in turn, you're going to have a better chance of implementing your strategic change. Now, there's some other things that you need to think about when you are implementing a strategic change. And I'm going to go through these quickly because they may be more relevant for some people in some situations than in others, but it's certainly things that you need to think about. The first is the pace and the timing of the change. How quickly should the change take place? Some things are like ripping off a Band-Aid. You want it to go really fast, and others, really it's better for them to unfold so slowly and incrementally that maybe the changes aren't even noticeable. The scope of the change is a very important question. Depending on the strategic problem that you're trying to solve, you need to decide if the whole organization needs to change or maybe just some specific component or part of the organization. For instance, maybe it's just your sales model or your pricing model that needs to change. You don't have to change everything in your product delivery system. Next is, what are the supporting structures for change? You have to think not just about the goal that you're trying to achieve, but making sure that everything else in your organization is sending the same message and reinforcing it. That may mean that you need to think about your reward system, your performance review system, your hiring system, your technological support system, and IT, things like that. So being aware of what you need surrounding your change endeavor to really support it is extremely important. How public should the change be? Is this something that is really just for an internal audience, or will adopting this change have a positive effect on your external constituents as well? This is particularly true for publicly traded companies whose shareholders may be very much affected by the changes that you're announced by you announcing a change, particularly in response to something that has been a problem for your organization in the eyes of those stakeholders. Of course, you have to think about the internal politics of change and really understanding how the different constituents within the organization feel about the change. This is going to be where your pockets of resistance arise, who your potential change agents are, who the influencers might be, really who you need to get into those guiding coalitions to help implement the change. And finally, how are you going to know if the change is happening and how effective it is? You need to have some monitoring system that you put in place to both reinforce the change and ensure that it's going as planned. And of course, if you implement a change and in your monitoring determine that it is not accomplishing the goal that you set out for it, how are you going to respond? How are you going to change your change effort? Now, history is rife with companies that failed to change and adapt, much to their bitter ends. For example, Kodak, the photography film company, actually invented digital film, but chose not to market it. And they really stuck with their traditional film model that eventually drove them right out of business as digital film technology took over. BlackBerry is a company that failed to adapt and respond to changes in the smartphone and mobile device industry. Newsweek and other print magazines and print news, those that failed to embrace a digital content delivery model have really struggled. The whole publishing industry is on the brink of failure except for those that have embraced a delivery of their content through digital devices. There's a long history of music companies failing to embrace the online streaming of music content, and huge conflicts between the music companies and the online streaming and delivery systems, even as more and more consumers of the music were going to those online streaming services to access the content. And Apple is a company that I have actually both on this, companies who failed to change and companies that embrace change. Here, Apple, this is the Apple from the 1980s and 90s when Steve Jobs had left, and they were really struggling to bring to market useful products that had any success. they failed in product after product, and they were really going down as really a flat company. And then Steve Jobs came back in the mid-1990s, and he completely reinvented the culture of the organization. He streamlined their product lines and refocused their strategy, and turned Apple around. And since then, it's been, you know, one of the most innovative companies on the planet. As I mentioned, many print news outlets have struggled, but those that really embrace and early adopters of digital content delivery have done really, really well. The International Herald Tribune, the New York Times, those were early adopters of digital content delivery and a blend or a blend of digital and print delivery, and they've actually thrived. Toyota is a car company that was an early embracer of alternative fuels and gained a great deal of market share by being an early adopter of hybrid and ultimately and eventually electric car systems that other of their competitors really scrambled to catch up with as demand moved for non-gasoline based fuels has increased. And Netflix is a great example of a company that has adapted to move away from its original model of delivering DVDs to people to online streaming, and actually made hard decisions about letting go of parts of its company that were no longer appropriate. They no longer offer DVD delivery or do so only at a premium, and over time have moved more into the production side, where they now produce their own content that they deliver through their streaming services. So to summarize, efforts to enact change should be comprehensively planned to focus on the rationale, the strategy, the implementation, and especially the recipients of change, and understand what their sources of resistance might be and what you can do to try to overcome them. And entrepreneurial firms and established firms are all affected by the concept that the ability to adapt to dynamic environments is a make or break strategic factor. And that in particular, your ability to adapt proactively rather than reactively in response to changes in the environment can be a source of strategic advantage. Thank you.